I believe that before creating a review, it's important to know why you're doing it. In this case, it's because I love Avatar. A lot. No, not that one. Oh god, not that one! That one. In fact, I consider Avatar, The Last Airbender, to be the greatest TV show of all time. I'm not saying it's perfect. Nothing is. What I am saying is that it's exceptionally high quality. Now, it has its flaws, like any piece of media does. To avoid being biased and presenting something based only on my opinion, I'm going to format my review in a way that points out both the good and bad aspects of the show. I'll be breaking down the plot of the show one or two episodes at a time. As I go through, I'll bring up points about the episode, some good, some bad. Then, at the end, I'll make a conclusion about the overall quality of the episode or episodes, based on the evidence I've presented. Obviously, the series will have spoilers for everything about Avatar, so if somehow you haven't seen it already, don't watch this video. Go watch Avatar if you haven't already. You're really missing out. With that out of the way, let's get started on the plot. We begin with some narration.
Water.
Now, narration is arguably one of the most heavy-handed ways to present exposition, but this was probably the best method in this instance. This show has a lot to set up, and starting with narration allows the show to get right into the story. It's also not like this is a common tool within the show. This is the only time the show narrates directly to the audience. This starting exposition is just setting up the framework for the story, and I would consider it to be beneficial to the show's storytelling as a whole. It turns out that the story is set in a world where some people have the ability to control, or bend, one of the four elements: water, fire, earth, and air.
Why? Because that works.
We aren't actually told about the origin of bending in this episode. It's only after we see it in action that we learn how it came to be. Avatar is a character-driven show, and since the characters don't know this yet, we don't get to either. Going back to the narration, we are told that over time, four nations formed, one for each element. This implies that bending ability is tied to location in some capacity. Anyway, the four nations lived in peace until
The Fire Nation attacked.
the Fire Nation attacked, presumably because they are evil. Actually, there's a much better reason than that, but that comes later on, so for now all we know is that they're evil. One person, the Avatar, can control all four elements. Why?
Because that works.
We get more information on the mechanics of the Avatar later, but again, the characters don't know yet, so we don't either. So the Fire Nation attacked and the Avatar vanished. Since the other nations were unprepared for war, the Fire Nation was relatively unopposed and managed to take control of much of the world. 100 years have passed, and the Fire Nation is nearing victory. I wonder if the Avatar is going to come back to defeat them. Our first character is a young girl from the Water Tribe named Katara. She was the one providing the narration, and it was in her voice and from her perspective. This explains the limited knowledge it was able to provide, as the information she knew was stated to be from the stories of her grandmother. Katara's father, along with all the men from her tribe, went to help the Earth Nation. Apparently their military doesn't include women. The Earth Nation is the largest nation, and is more or less equal in power to the Fire Nation. Most of the war is fought between the Fire Nation and the Earth Nation. Additionally, a large part of the show is set in the Earth Nation. Anyway, she and her brother are out fishing. They live at the South Pole because I guess they couldn't find anywhere better to live. She shows off by trying to catch a fish with water bending, but ends up getting water on Sokka, her brother. As a result, they get into an argument, and a current sweeps them up because they weren't paying attention. This is followed by an intense action sequence where they have to navigate the current. Eventually, their boat gets crushed and they are stranded on an iceberg. Then Sokka does a sexism, which makes Katara mad.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
Katara does some anger bending and explodes an iceberg. It starts glowing and it's the Avatar! How surprising and convenient. If it weren't for that, we wouldn't have a plot, now would we? This brings me to my first point, which is, sadly, negative. I'm sorry, but I can't not point out how the plot is kickstarted by contrivance, or at least convenience. I understand that starting a plot is hard, but I'm trying to be objective here, and this isn't really something that can be ignored. Katara whacks the iceberg with a stick, and a big beacon of light shoots up, alerting our antagonist, Prince Zuko. Prince Zuko is a Fire Nation prince, and he is evil. Wait, no he's not. He's a layered, well-written antagonist. This is my next point, which is, of course, a positive one. He may not get that much attention in these first few episodes, but you get a glimpse of someone with motivations and a backstory. At the very least, it's clear that he has a personality. Take note, Marvel movies. He's been searching for the Avatar and correctly guesses that the beacon is exactly that. His uncle is sad that he won't be able to finish his game of Weeaboo Solitaire. Sensibly, he tries to tell Zuko that it might be a different magical light and that he should drink some calming tea. Zuko does not want tea.
I don't need any calming tea!
Meanwhile, Sokka pokes the Avatar with a stick, to Katara's dismay.
Stop!
And he wakes up. He's horny after 100 years in Iceberg, so he acts as though he has something important to say, and tries to seduce Katara with the incredibly romantic question of,
Will you go penguin sledding with me?
Okay. As for how the Avatar is alive, well...
I'm not sure.
And that's all we really get on that. Then the Avatar wakes up his buffalo, Appa, who can fly.
They fly now! They fly now!
Why can he fly? Well, we find out later that Sky Bison were the first Airbenders, so that kind of answers the question. These two things, the fact that the Avatar managed to survive 100 years in an iceberg and didn't age, and the fact that Appa can fly, aren't really explained, but neither of them is a contrivance, nor a logical flaw. Since this is the first episode, they're free to establish anything they want to. As long as the things they introduce aren't contradicted later, there's nothing wrong with it. It might seem strange that someone has the power to survive in an iceberg, or that a huge bison has the ability to fly. But as long as it's internally consistent, we have no reason to think these things wouldn't be the case. While it might be nice to know how these things work exactly, this falls under the category of character knowledge. Since the show is explaining things through our characters, it wouldn't make sense if we got to know something that they didn't. Going back to the story, Appa then sneezes on Sokka. Sokka is not happy about this, and accuses the Avatar of being a Fire Nation spy. The Avatar sneezes himself into the air and introduces himself. His name is Aang. Katara says that Aang is an Airbender, thus stating the obvious. Sokka is confused by this whole affair and attempts to return home, only to remember he is lost. So they attempt to fly home on Appa, much to Sokka's dismay. Appa is tired and, as a result, falls into the ocean. Appa being tired becomes a plot point several times in this show. On the way, Sokka is disgusted by Aang's obvious crush on Katara. Zuko is staring at the horizon. His uncle tells him to get some rest, but he really likes staring at the horizon. He clearly really wants to find the Avatar. His uncle tries to dissuade him, saying that his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather all tried and failed to capture the Avatar. Zuko counters that his honor, unlike that of his ancestors, hinges on the Avatar's capture, and continues to stare at the horizon. Yet more evidence of a backstory, and examples of Zuko being a well-developed antagonist. Aang hides the fact that he is the Avatar, thus creating conflict. Well, it could be a conflict, but no one really gets mad at him for it. Aang falls asleep on the way to the village. He has a bad dream about falling into the ocean and almost drowning, but he manages to tap into the power of the Avatar. His eyes glow, and he creates an air bubble around him to keep himself alive. He also creates a shell of ice around it. Aang being the Avatar is directly shown to be the justification for his survival. This is the extent of his backstory for now. Aang wakes up in the village. The village is boring and small, with 1 or 2 dozen people. Katara introduces him to everyone. They are not characters and never come up again. The only one who is a character is Gran, Katara's grandmother. She gets maybe a few minutes of screen time and is never seen again outside of this episode, but she receives a backstory later, unlike the rest of the village. They never come up again at all. The villagers are shocked to see Aang, as airbenders are thought to be extinct. You might have already guessed that from the title though. I'm pointing this out because, of course, it will become important later. Aang has a glider and says he can fly. Sokka says humans can't fly.
Are you sure about that?
Sokka was wrong, and Aang can, in fact, fly. Aang crashes into Sokka's watchtower, which upsets Sokka. This is a silly but effective way of establishing an ability that Aang will have throughout the series. Establishing this ability early on means that when Aang needs to use it later, the audience will already be aware of it. Additionally, the fact that Aang can't fly without some assistance, either Appa or his glider, is a good limitation to have. I don't know if you've ever considered this, but flight is an extremely powerful ability. Heroes like Superman always have an advantage over their flightless counterparts. Making Aang's flight dependent on a glider or a mount means that in a situation where the writers need Aang to not fly, they can reasonably take this ability away. Then Katara has to do chores. Wait, what chores are there to do in an icy wasteland? Were they already trying to get food by fishing? Well, I fucked that up. Great job, guys. Now your tribe is gonna starve. Zuko's uncle is making him do firebending drills. Zuko is doing it wrong, so Iroh explains that firebending is tied to breathing. Breath becomes energy, which extends beyond your limbs and becomes fire. I'm giving Avatar another point here for doing such a good job of building the mechanics of bending, even in the first episode. Even if we don't know where it comes from, we still get to see how it works. Zuko's uncle tells him to drill again. Zuko's bored with basic drills, so he attacks the soldiers who are helping him train.
You're fired!
And demands that his uncle teach him advanced techniques. He says he'll need more than basic firebending to defeat the Avatar. Clearly, despite his confident demeanor, he still has some nervousness and wants to make sure he's fully prepared. His uncle reluctantly agrees, but first pulls a roast duck out of nowhere and eats it, thus asserting dominance. It's not clear where he was keeping that or how his pockets are big enough to hold an entire roast duck, but it's not really a big deal, and I think the absurdity of it is why it's funny. Now, I'm giving Avatar another point for Uncle Iroh. In fact, pretty much every episode is going to get a point for Uncle Iroh, unless he's not in it for some reason. This is because Iroh is the best. Sokka gives a rousing and masculine speech to the children he's training to be warriors, who don't care. Aang makes a joke about the ice toilet, which annoys Sokka. Sokka angrily says that they don't have time for jokes with a war going on. Aang asks, "What war?" before immediately becoming distracted by a penguin. Most of the animals in this world are a mix of two different real-world animals, so penguins are also seals. Sokka thinks Aang must be joking about not knowing about the war. This is the show telling us about how widespread and significant the war is. When Sokka doesn't even take the idea that someone hasn't heard of it seriously, we know it's a big deal. I briefly considered giving Avatar a point for this, but then I realized that this isn't specific enough, nor is it a good example. I want my points to be specific, with strong evidence to support my statements. This would just be good storytelling. Besides, this is just the most basic level of good writing. I guess it goes to show the quality of media being produced nowadays. I'm at the point where a story giving the audience information without directly telling them and making the viewer use their brain is impressive to me. It's kind of sad, to be honest. Returning to the story, Katara wants Aang to teach her waterbending. Aang is still pretending not to be the Avatar, and thus acts as though he's only capable of airbending. He asks if there's any waterbenders who can teach her, but it turns out she's the only one in the South Pole. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the amazing storytelling of this show. This line about there only being one waterbender there, as insignificant as it may seem, is noteworthy because it becomes relevant near the end of the series. This is a sign of a story being really great, but you can go back and review and notice connections you didn't before. Thus, I'm giving Avatar another point for how interconnected its story is. To be clear, I'm not giving this episode a point for what other episodes do. That would be ridiculous. This episode gets a point because of its ability to set up stuff that later episodes pay off. The episodes that pay it off will get a separate point for their ability to do that. Aang says they should go to the North Pole to find her a teacher. The North Pole is where the other water tribe is. There are two of them, one in the south and one in the north. Katara is unsure about this, but this will become her motivation for the first season. After that, they casually commit penguin abuse while laughing an abnormal amount. Then they find a crashed Fire Nation ship, and Katara is sad. Aang wants to explore it, but Katara thinks it could be dangerous, saying that there might be booby traps. Then, Aang gives her some very bad advice. He says that if you want to be a bender, you have to, quote, let go of fear. This is bad because fear can actually be helpful by getting you to not do dumb stuff, but Katara follows his advice. As a result, we get more backstory. Apparently the ship was part of the first attack of the Fire Nation. Katara then uses logic to conclude that, because Aang doesn't know of the war, and the war has been going on for 100 years, he must have been frozen for at least 100 years.
Yeah, this is big brain time.
Aang is horrified, as one is when they discover they've been frozen for 100 years.
Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god! Oh man! Oh god!
I guess you could say it gives him anxiety. Aang is happy that he got to meet Katara though, so it's all okay. Apparently.
You're a simp.
Unsurprisingly, bad advice leads to bad results in the end, as they trigger a trap that locks the door and launches a flare. I personally feel that fear being helpful is a theme in this episode, since Katara ignoring her fear led to bad results. Actually, isn't a flare used to signal for help? Why are there being a trap set up to do that? Also, why are there booby traps set up in the first place? Didn't this ship crash? Were the booby traps set up before, while the ship was being used? I mean, I guess so. I guess that's the explanation for this. This is another instance of plot contrivance, but since I already made a negative point about it, this just adds to the existing one. Aang uses airbending to jump out a hole in the roof. Then Zuko sees them on the ship as a result of the flare.
Enemy spotted.
It makes sense that he would see the flare, but it's kind of convenient that he would be in the right place considering how big South Poles tend to be. Zuko commits a roll credits moment.
The last Airbender.
Now, I'm not CinemaSins, so I'm not actually going to count this as a bad thing. There's no reason Zuko wouldn't be saying this as he's commenting on seeing, well, the last Airbender. It's still kind of funny though. Then he comments that Aang is agile for his old age. It's funny because he didn't actually age, see? He tells the person who works on the ship to wake his uncle, which isn't very nice, and tell him he found the Avatar. Zuko looks around and sees the Water Tribe village. This is the last shot of the episode, foreshadowing the attack that comes in the next one. The episode ends with a screen saying, "To be continued." It's worth noting this is actually the only episode where it says that. The second episode, and every episode after, have a shorter intro, which does not include the exposition dump we got in the first one. However, it does include a recap of the earlier parts of the show, which includes clips that are relevant to the current episode. I guess there are some people who watch the first episode of a show, go away for a month, forget what happened, and then come back to it.
What's wrong with you?
Anyway, the Water Tribe saw the flare too, and Sokka, thinking that his fears of Aang being a spy have been confirmed, banishes him, because that's just something he can do, I guess.
That man's an imposter.
Also, I can't help but laugh at how angry the villagers look here. Katara is sad and tries to get Gran to overrule it, but she agrees with Sokka. Katara tells Sokka that he's making a mistake, but he says he's keeping his promise to their father, to protect them from threats like Aang. The writers could have simply had him say he was trying to protect them, but instead they used this line to set up part of Sokka's character motivation. His promise to his father comes up later, you can be sure of that. Katara is angry and says she'll go with Aang to the North Pole. Then Sokka asks if she's really going to choose a stranger over her family. Aang says he doesn't want to get in between her and her family, and so Katara eventually decides not to go. Aang cordially says goodbye, but Sokka continues to be a jerk, taunting him about Appa not flying. Aang tries to get Appa to fly, but Appa continues to not fly because he's lazy. Seriously, you were frozen for 100 years, how are you tired? One of the children asks Aang not to leave, but of course he doesn't have a choice, so Aang apologizes before he does leave. Gran tries to comfort Katara, but Katara yells at her about ruining her one chance to learn waterbending. Originally, I was going to make a negative point here because I considered this conflict to be unnecessary and uninteresting, but after taking a step back and looking at it more carefully, I realized that the behavior of all the characters makes perfect sense. Katara can still catch up to Aang at this point, but it's not about physical restrictions, it's about emotional ones. Katara makes the tough decision to stay with her family rather than pursue her desire to learn waterbending. Sokka forces Aang to leave, and Gran backs him up. They do this because they both want to keep people safe. As for Aang, he leaves willingly because he believes it's best for everyone. Really, this entire thing isn't about making logical decisions, it's about making emotional decisions. The reason I bring this up is because I want to show that this is an objective review, not just my opinion. It doesn't matter whether or not I personally like something, it matters whether or not that thing is consistent and well written. This conflict does fit into several of the characters' progressions during this episode, but I'll talk about that later. The show continues to employ toilet humor, with the child needing to use the toilet, but Sokka telling him to help defend against the Fire Nation. Despite this, the show manages to convey deep themes, showing that when adults are gone, children, particularly Sokka and Katara, have to take over. It's the first of many meaningful messages in this show. I'm giving Avatar a point here for managing to be so meaningful while also not taking itself too seriously. Having both comedy and emotion is hard, and this show nails it. Aang is busy being sad while lying in a hole in the iceberg, and he sees Zuko's ship heading towards the water village. He runs to their aid and tells Appa to wait there, though he's been so lazy up until this point that I don't know what else you would expect him to do. We then see both Zuko and Sokka preparing for battle, with Sokka putting on war paint and Zuko having his armor put on by servants. Many of the characters in the show are pretty badass, and this is the first of many instances where this is demonstrated. It also emphasizes both the similarities and differences between Sokka and Zuko, resulting from their different backgrounds. Zuko has servants, while Sokka must prepare on his own. However, as different as they are still both warriors, and they value the ceremonial aspect of combat. I'd also like to take the time to note that this show has very good music, and the music that plays during this scene really sets a tense and dramatic tone for the coming battle. Sokka stands atop the battlements he built from snow, waiting for the Fire Nation to arrive. The ground starts to shake, destroying the watchtower. Since it was previously destroyed, I guess he rebuilt it. You should have gotten Katara to waterbend you and ice wall, that would have been more sturdy. The ship comes towards the village, pointed right at Sokka. On the one hand, this is kind of unlikely, but there's a couple of wide shots that show that Sokka is more or less centered on the top of the wall, so I guess it's okay. The ground begins to crack, and the child is about to fall into the chasm, but Katara saves him. This is an early character moment for Katara, showing that she takes care of others. Saving a child is a common device in showing that a character is kind, caring, and helpful to others, but it's an effective one. Children can't fend for themselves and need to be protected, so this is an effective tool in developing any character. Katara yells at Sokka to get out of the way, but he just stands there, preparing to hit the giant warship with basically a stick.
Not a great plan.
It might seem like Sokka's just being dumb, but this actually demonstrates one of his major character traits. He not only is brave to the point of arrogance and even stupidity, but he is also willing to put himself at risk to protect others, even in the face of an impossibly strong opponent. Sokka refuses to move, but fortunately the warship stops before it hits him. Steam issues from the ship, demonstrating the steampunk aesthetic of the Fire Nation's army. There are several shots of the ship which use perspective to show us how big it is by making it look even bigger. It towers over the village, and Sokka is visibly scared. Yet he still does not run, only moving out of the way when he is threatened to be crushed by the front of the ship, which drops down to allow Zuko and his soldiers to disembark. The steam clears, and Zuko and his men walk down the ramp, with several shots of them to emphasize their intimidation factor. Iroh doesn't appear in this scene, which makes sense given how little interest he has shown in capturing the Avatar so far. Sokka charges them recklessly, but Zuko simply knocks the weapon out of his hand, kicks him aside, and he falls and gets stuck in the snow. The village gasps, as though an even remotely competent warrior would have been threatened by Sokka's frenzied onslaught. Hell, the way Sokka was charging, I think even I could have done what Zuko did, or at least something to achieve the same effect. Showing that Sokka is good at fighting isn't the point here, though. No, what's more important is that he's brave and determined. Skill can be earned, but courage is intrinsic. This is the basis of Sokka's character. Zuko makes his way to the people of the village. They're all outside, even though there was a shot of them trying to hide in the tent. I guess they realized that hiding was no good. Anyway, Zuko says, "Where are you hiding him?" meaning the Avatar. Way to assume the Avatar's gender, Zuko. He grabs Gran Gran and says,
"He'd be about this age? Master of all elements?"
"Get it? It's funny because he didn't age." Then he lets Gran Gran go and shoots fire at everyone, missing intentionally, only aiming to intimidate them. Zuko says, "I know you're hiding him," before Sokka retrieves his weapon and rushes Zuko again, but foolishly decides to employ a battle cry that gets Zuko's attention. I'd also like to point out that some of Sokka's war paint is gone by this point, but not all of it, demonstrating attention to detail where continuity is concerned. This time, Zuko simply dodges, and Sokka goes flying, with a slow-motion shot of his humiliation. Zuko attacks Sokka with Firebending, but he dodges and throws his boomerang, which Zuko narrowly manages to dodge. Now Zuko is getting really pissed. One of the children who Sokka was training cries,
Show no fear!
and throws Sokka a spear. Sokka runs at Zuko once again, but Zuko breaks off the spearhead and grabs the shaft. Zuko jabs him in the face with it, accompanied by a comedic sound effect. Zuko breaks the spear in half, and Sokka falls to the ground, accompanied by a sliding whistle effect. Another funny sound. This show has amazing sound design. The music, the sound effects, the voice acting, all of it comes together to instill exactly the mix of emotions that the show wants you to feel. Then, there's a glimmer in the distance, and the boomerang comes back and smacks Zuko in the head. See, it's moments like these that make Sokka one of my favorite characters, not only in this show, but in general. He succeeds through sheer determination, and manages to be badass while still being funny. This show has the best fight scenes I've seen anywhere. Not only are they incredibly well choreographed, but everyone is a character moment as well. Every one of them feels meaningful, building up conflicts between the characters, which is the difference between a good fight scene and one that's purely for spectacle. Pretty much every episode is going to get a point for this, since pretty much every episode has at least one great fight scene. At the very least, I can promise you this show will never lose points for a bad fight scene, because there aren't any. Zuko is dazed and briefly staggers before becoming even more enraged. He ignites jets of fire, like daggers, in his hands and prepares to attack Sokka for real this time. These daggers of fire were probably intended to be Zuko's signature attack or something, but sadly they only appear a few times. Zuko usually resorts to regular old firebending, which is cool, but this would have been cool as well. I feel like we didn't see enough of it. Not a bad thing, just a comment I had to make. Then along comes Aang, riding a penguin, and knocks Zuko over. He lands upside down with his helmet falling on top of him, and all the village children laugh. This exchange perfectly sets up Zuko as an intimidating but arrogant villain. He's so confident that he doesn't take his opponent seriously, only attacking after he is made angry. His short temper is also his weakness, shown by him becoming distracted and allowing Aang to catch him off guard. Aang cheerily says hi to Sokka and Katara. Sokka thanks him for coming, though in a tone that makes it clear that he thinks Aang's happiness is misplaced given the current situation. Zuko gets up and takes a combat stance. His soldiers stand back, forming a circle to make sure Aang doesn't try to leave. Zuko wants to face Aang himself, which ties into his motivation of wanting to regain his honor. It's clear he wants to prove himself by defeating a powerful opponent. Aang uses airbending to spray Zuko with snow. The snow begins to melt, which is a subtle but beneficial detail that adds to Zuko's intimidation factor. Zuko realizes that Aang is the Avatar. Sokka and Katara are shocked for some reason, as if it wasn't obvious or at least reasonable to assume. I mean, the Avatar disappears when you know it was going to be an Airbender? Then an Airbender shows up and you're surprised when he turns it out to be the Avatar? My bets would be on him being the Avatar, otherwise I wouldn't imagine he would have been able to survive. Zuko is shocked, stating that he's trained hard, expecting a great opponent, not a child. Aang points out that Zuko is just a teenager, provoking Zuko to attack. Zuko attacks with several blasts of fire, and all Aang can do is spin his staff to disperse the flame. Aang hears the screams of the villagers and realizes that if he stays here, people are going to get hurt. He offers to give himself up if Zuko leaves the village alone. Zuko lowers his stance, nods, and the soldiers take Aang away. This exchange, despite being difficult to qualify as an actual fight, considering only one of the people involved actually attacks, shows the personalities of both of these characters extremely well. Aang and Zuko both hate unnecessary violence. Aang gives himself up to protect the village, and Zuko honors his promise to leave the village alone. Zuko doesn't want random people to get hurt. He's not evil, he's not hateful. He just wants to achieve his goal, and if there's no need to hurt innocents, he has no desire to hurt innocents. Katara tries to stop Aang, but he says it'll be okay. He says to take care of Appa until he gets back, making it clear that he doesn't understand the severity of his situation, or that he doesn't want to. Although, there's a good chance that Aang is already planning to escape from Zuko, so that could explain why he acts this way. Zuko says, plot a course for the Fire Nation. I'm going home. We find out later that Zuko is motivated not just by a desire to prove himself in general, but specifically a desire to prove himself to his father. This line reflects Zuko's desire to regain his honor and return home. He wants to be with his family. He wants to be worthy of it. He calls the Fire Nation his home, despite not having been there for years. It's clear that he still cares about the people he left behind, even after all this time. Katara wants to help Aang. Sokka starts to speak, but she interrupts him, thinking he will try to disagree. Then he reveals that he wants to go too. A message for certain people who like to subvert expectations. That's the right way to do it, where it adds to the story and characters instead of undermining them. Then Gran shows up, and it seems like she is going to try and stop him. Then she tells them how it's been a long time since she's had hope, and Katara brought it back. She says that Aang is the world's only hope, and they found him for a reason. Now their destinies are intertwined with Aang's. The voice acting in the show is also on point, by the way. Gran sounds very wise and hopeful in this scene, and it gets you excited for all the adventures to come. Or at least it gets me excited for them. This is the start of the biggest theme in Avatar.
Destiny.
Fate.
Destiny.
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 Fate.
Destiny gets mentioned a lot, and most of the characters have motivations based on their destiny, or what they believe their destiny to be, or wanting to change their destiny. Recently, certain people have been using themes as an excuse for the shortcomings in a piece of media, but a theme is nothing more than an underlying message in a story. The message in a story has no value unless the story is actually good on its own merits. In this case, the story is good, so the theme is also good. Zuko says Aang's staff will make an excellent gift for his father, and mocks Aang for not knowing a father is due to being raised by monks. This single line provides further insight into the value Zuko places on family, as Zuko is demonstrated to want to prove himself to his father. He also looks down upon those who don't have the same idea of family as he does. Zuko tells the guards to take Aang to a holding cell, and then tells Iroh, rather rudely, to take the staff to his quarters for him. After Zuko walks away, Iroh asks a guard to take the staff to his quarters for him, in a much more polite manner than Zuko did. This is not only an entertaining character moment, but it also provides further insight into those characters' personalities and relationships. Zuko clearly doesn't properly appreciate Iroh's mentorship, acting as if he is the one in charge. Iroh is shown to be a kind and polite person, not reprimanding Zuko for his rudeness, in the same way as earlier when Zuko demanded to be taught advanced firebending. However, he still doesn't allow himself to be ordered around, getting the guard to transport the staff rather than doing it himself, and delaying Zuko's training rather than outright denying him. He is also polite to the guard, despite being the guard's superior, asking rather than ordering them like Zuko did. Aang waits until he's being escorted to a holding cell on the Fire Nation ship to make his move. Since his hands are tied, he airbends by breathing, launching himself backwards into one of the guards and slamming the other against the door of what would have been his cell. Aang runs quickly, but the alarm is raised before he can get far. This establishes that bending, or at least certain types of bending, don't require full mobility. Airbending can be achieved using only the breath. Katara quickly realizes that they won't catch up to the warship in a canoe, so they take Appa. Appa still refuses to fly, opting merely to swim, so Sokka recites synonyms for fly.
Go. Fly. Soar. Up. Ascend. Elevate.
Then he remembers there was a specific phrase that Aang said, stumbling through a few phrases before correctly reaching yip yip. And Appa finally flies. Sokka's very excited, but Katara gives him an "I told you so" look, so he tries to pass it off as though he's not actually that impressed. Moments like these establish character dynamics, chemistry, and personalities early on, allowing their later interactions to be consistent with what we already know about them, thus making them much more satisfying. Aang runs into some guards and asks them for his glider staff. They raise their spears to attack, so he runs across the walls using airbending, calling.
Thanks anyway.
He enters the next level through a hatch, and there's a guard waiting for him. I guess he was just standing there? Anyway, he attacks Aang with fire, but Aang jumps over him and knocks him over by grabbing his helmet. That's what you get for being horny. I also just noticed while editing this that Aang uses the horns on the guard's helmet to sever the ropes around his hands, thus knocking him over, and I have to say, that's extremely smart, both on the part of the writers and on the part of Aang. Another good setup that this episode provides is establishing the individual threat level of different Fire Nation guards. Depending on the uniform, you can tell whether they're an ordinary person or a firebender. The guards with masks over their faces and spiked helmets are able to firebend, as demonstrated by the guard who attacks Aang with firebending being masked and having this uniform, whereas the guards with their faces showing attack with ordinary weapons and presumably are more focused on manning the ship and unrelated tasks to firebending. This is great because it makes it clear what the stakes are against the Fire Nation, and it's clear a lot of thought was put into every aspect of this show. It makes sense that not all the soldiers would be firebenders. Manning a warship takes a lot of people, and even though firebenders would obviously make better fighters, it would be advantageous to prioritize quantity over quality. Even if the Fire Nation is evil, at least they're inclusive. Aang continues to look for his glider, opening door after door. One of the doors leads to Iroh's room. Iroh is taking a nap, so Aang quietly closes the door. Then he whispers, "Sorry." Aang's mouth stretches out when he says this in a very cartoony way. Normally I love this show's art style, but there are a few times when certain elements look off-putting to me, and this is one of those times. It just looks weird. The third room Aang checks has his staff in it.
My staff.
Earlier it was mentioned that the staff was being taken to Zuko's quarters, another example of great continuity, so you can probably guess what happens next.
Looks like I underestimated you.
Zuko's hiding inside and closes the door, preparing to attack Aang. Zuko attacks ruthlessly, but Aang is far more agile than he is. Aang avoids all of Zuko's attacks, though narrowly, so it doesn't feel as if there are no stakes. Despite his agility, Aang is clearly outmatched, and he will get hit eventually. Aang uses trickery to win this conflict, wrapping Zuko in a banner and holding him in place. Zuko breaks free in a burst of fire, but Aang takes the opportunity to get a free attack in. He uses airbending to slam Zuko against the ceiling and wall, stunning him. By the time Zuko is able to recover, Aang has escaped. Aang makes it to the front of the ship and tries to take off with his glider. Then, Zuko comes out of nowhere, jumps, and grabs his leg.
What? What the fuck?
No, this is nonsense. There's absolutely no way that Zuko could have gotten here so fast. By the time he recovered from his beating, Aang was already well ahead of him. While all the other issues I've mentioned so far have been merely contrivances and/or conveniences, this is something else. This is a logical flaw. Now you might be saying, well, it's demonstrated later in the show that firebending can be used to propel yourself forward. And you'd be right, except A, Aang also has super speed, as demonstrated mere seconds ago when he ran across the wall with superhuman speed. And B, only a few firebenders are shown to be able to do this, all of whom are above Zuko's skill level. Besides, using something that's presented later in the show to justify a logical flaw that's happening now would essentially be a retcon. However you count it, this makes no sense, and my love for the show will not get me to look past this. You might say, well, what does it matter? Wouldn't episodes still play out the same? The answer is no. The finale of this episode would have been entirely different if Zuko had obeyed the restrictions to his mobility that should apply. Instead of fighting them on the ship, Zuko would have had to chase them down, resulting in an entirely different action scene. Instead of just another combat scene, which we already got, we could have had a chase scene, which would have been new and interesting. As shown by what I've just said, adhering to logical consistency doesn't restrict the writer's abilities to create spectacle. In fact, it can give way to new and interesting ideas for action sequences. By making sure your story is written in a way that makes perfect sense, you can have new ideas that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Restrictions lead to creativity, and when writers just ignore the boundaries they've set up or the logic that they should adhere to, it's not just worse because it doesn't make sense, it's also worse because simply ignoring restrictions reduces the need for creativity. This perfectly demonstrates how having logical consistency is always better than not having it. Appa shows up, briefly distracting Aang and Zuko. Then, Zuko resumes his attack, fiercely blasting Aang with fire. Aang, having been brought down by Zuko grabbing him, deflects the fire, nearly falls off the boat, and eventually has his weapon blasted out of his hands. Then he actually does fall off the boat. Aang is dazed and begins sinking, but his eyes open and start to glow. Then he creates a water tornado, and knocks Zuko and his soldiers overboard. Aang is drained greatly by this exercise of power and collapses from exhaustion. This prevents him from being an overpowered character. This ability only gives him a temporary burst of power, and it drains him greatly. If he could just do this with no consequences, there would be much less tension anytime he was in a bad situation. It also stands to reason that, because this display of power is so draining, the energy required for an even larger display of power would be even more draining. This would eventually be too much for Aang to handle, meaning that there must be some sort of limit to the amount of power he can channel in this way. He's also unable to do it on purpose, which means that not only is this ability limited in what it can do, but it's also limited in when it can be used. It appears that this ability manifests on its own only in the face of serious danger, and later episodes confirm this to be true. Thus, Aang can't simply use this to solve all his problems, he'll have to overcome them with methods other than being powerful. Hey, what's this footage of Rey doing here? Katara and Sokka come to his aid. He thanks them for their help and tells them he dropped his staff. Sokka goes to get it, but Zuko is holding onto the edge and grabs it. This is strange because when Zuko fell off, it looked like he fell further than that. Well, at least he didn't manage to pull himself up all on his own. That would have been really stupid. Sokka tries to yank the staff out of Zuko's grip. Zuko tries to use this to pull himself up, but Sokka bonks him in the face like Zuko did to him earlier, and thus Sokka overcomes Zuko. Zuko falls, but manages to grab a chain on the side of the ship. Some of the remaining soldiers are coming to attack Katara and Sokka. Katara tries to freeze them, but accidentally freezes Sokka's legs in place instead. She tries again, and this time manages to successfully freeze them all. Her progression in this episode is complete. She went from struggling to waterbend and wanting a teacher, to utilizing her powers effectively in combat, demonstrating that she as a character has potential usefulness. This isn't to say that she doesn't have room to grow. She's obviously still new at waterbending, but she has reached some level of competence with it. It would be easy for our protagonist to be overshadowed by the super powerful being that is the Avatar, but Sokka and Katara's individual victories demonstrate that all the characters will be utilized in a way that makes them necessary, regardless of individual power level. When Katara begins to waterbend, it's worth noting that the soldiers hesitate for a moment, before her miserable attempt at freezing them bolsters their confidence. Their hesitation is a good detail, not only because they probably weren't expecting her to be able to do that, which also ties in with the line about Katara being the only waterbender, but also because they would have never seen a waterbender before. I'd like to make the point that these episodes have something truly special. It's something that, in under an hour, they managed to do better than many movies twice as long as they are. That thing is character progression. Yes, you heard me, these first 2 episodes that have the job of introducing our characters also does the job of developing them. Most of the characters have some form of progression just within these 2 episodes. Sokka is initially bested by Zuko, but is later able to overcome him. True, he didn't actually defeat Zuko in direct combat, but he did have the chance to get back at him, which will probably serve to boost his confidence. He also goes from not trusting Aang to helping Katara rescue him. Initially, he is fearful of Aang and banishes him in an effort to keep his promise to protect the village. However, after Aang puts himself at risk to protect the village, and after he's also revealed to be the Avatar, he realizes that Aang is on their side. Plus, as the Avatar, Aang is the only one capable of ending the war, and ending the war is the only way to guarantee his village's safety. Zuko starts out anxious to prove himself, then finds out the Avatar is just a child. As a result, he underestimates Aang and loses. By the end of that episode, he has become determined not to make the same mistake again. This is parallel to Aang's transformation from a silly kid to a powerful Avatar, and when Aang goes full Avatar mode at the end of the episode, it ensures we won't underestimate him either. In addition to this, Aang goes from hiding that he's the Avatar and leaving to protect Katara and her tribe, to accepting his responsibility and beginning his journey to master the elements. Katara gets development too, initially giving up her chance to learn waterbending to stay with her family, before realizing, like Sokka does, that Aang is the Avatar and that she has a chance to do something important. She also goes from struggling with waterbending at the beginning of the episode to successfully freezing the soldiers who are attacking her at the end. If Katara had started out being good at waterbending, she and Sokka wouldn't have gotten into an argument, and subsequently they wouldn't have even found Aang, which makes the beginning of Katara's development even more important than the end. Now, you might question why Katara got better at waterbending when she didn't receive any formal training. I think that this is a demonstration of how mindset has a place in bending. At the beginning of the episode, when Katara tries to waterbend, she is visibly nervous. When she tries to freeze the soldiers the first time, she is also clearly nervous. But the second time, she looks away and trusts her instincts. She was able to use her waterbending because she became more confident in her abilities. She didn't become unreasonably strong without training. Freezing a few soldiers isn't exactly a huge demonstration of power, especially next to what we see Aang do. I don't think the amount of growth Katara experiences in terms of power is unreasonable for a change in mindset. Even Gran gets some development. Initially, she supports Sokka's decision to banish Aang, but like Sokka, after Aang puts himself at risk to protect the village and is revealed to be the Avatar, she realizes that Aang is on their side, and that it's important that they help him, as he is the only hope of stopping the war. This is another example of how much good writing they managed to cram into just these 2 episodes. Sokka breaks his feet out of the ice with his boomerang, while complaining about magic and flying. Sokka's attitude towards bending and other mystical phenomena in this episode demonstrates that he's a man of science, or at least whatever is equivalent to science in this universe, and likes things to make sense. This attitude is carried over into the rest of the show, so good job setting up so much stuff so effectively in these episodes, writers. They fly off, and there's a shot of Iroh, who has woken up, coming out onto the deck and rubbing his eyes, clearly confused at the flying bison. Again, Iroh is the best. Aro helps Zuko up, and Zuko orders his men to shoot them down. Then he apparently changes his mind, and he and Aro shoot a huge blast of fire at Aang and friends.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
Aang deflects it, but when he does, the camera zooms in on his face for some reason. This is weird to me because it prevents you from realizing what Aang was doing until the second after he does. Was it to save on animation? It was to save on animation, wasn't it? Also, I'd like to point out how pissed Aang looks in this one frame. The fire rebounds into an iceberg, which crashes down, damaging Zuko's ship. This is the first of many instances in Avatar where firebending is shown to be potentially harmful to its users and their allies. Firebenders have a tendency to lose control of their emotions and make rash decisions that lead to the destruction of their own resources. This provides a way to defeat evil firebenders and a problem to overcome for good firebenders. Aro remarks that it's good news that the Avatar is merely a child, but Zuko points out what Aang managed to accomplish. He swears not to underestimate him again, and tells his men to dig the ship out of the ice so we can follow our protagonists. Also, I love how Zuko's men are thawing the frozen soldiers out of the ice with firebending. It's perfectly logical, but also kind of funny, and it is another good but subtle use of bending. Going back to the plot, Katara asks Aang how he made the water tornado. He's not sure about that either. Don't worry, most things in this show get explained eventually. They just give you a chance to wonder about the answer first, or maybe even try and guess based on what you already know. Wait, a show that actually gets you to think? That's crazy! Aang says that he didn't tell them he was the Avatar because he never wanted to be. Katara tells him that in order to assist in the war, he needs to learn the elements, starting with water. They can go to the North Pole to learn waterbending together, and Sokka, who wants to fight the Fire Nation like his father did, will get a chance to do so. Everyone's motivations are considered by the group, and they're all satisfied by this arrangement. It's easy for a show to just go, oh, our characters go along with what the main character wants because it needs to happen. But this is much better. Everyone has a good reason to go along with this plan. Always remember, character motivations are very important. Of course, Aang doesn't take anything seriously, so he says they should travel to a bunch of places to ride animals. I wouldn't even mention it, except then he says,
Then back over here we'll ride the hog monkeys. They don't like people riding them, but that's what makes it fun.
What the fuck?
Anyway, that's the end of the episode. At the end of almost every episode, a simple, haunting music box melody plays. Hearing it gives me chills down my spine in anticipation of what's to come. Alright, that's it. I'm giving Avatar a point for its music. The music in this show is really good, in that it helps set the tone for scenes, which is exactly what music is meant to do. This point is also for the other elements of sound design, such as voice acting and sound effects, which are just as on point as the music. What did I think of these episodes? Well, let's take a look at my points. The first one, which was negative, was about how the plot was kickstarted by contrivance, or at least convenience. The fact that Aang just happened to be at the North Pole, and the fact that Katara and Sokka just happened to get lost, and the fact that they just happened to end up in the same place Aang was, and the fact that Zuko just happened to be at the South Pole as well, and the fact that a Fire Nation ship just happened to have a booby-trapped flare for some reason. Like seriously, why was the flare set up like that? Do you know what flares are for? They're for getting other people's attention if you're in trouble. Why would it be set up to go off with a tripwire? Was that trap set up before the ship crashed? Did someone set it up after the ship crashed? Did they stick around to do that? Why? It's just not an ideal way to start your story. Now to be fair, basically every story starts with some sort of contrivance, but just because other people do it doesn't make it good. The next point, a good one this time, was Zuko's early development. Unlike shows like Adventure Time, which start out with an evil, over-the-top villain, and then dump some character development onto them later, Zuko has depth right from the very beginning. Over the course of these two episodes, Zuko goes from anxious, to annoyed with having trained so hard for what he considers to be an unworthy opponent, to disillusioned, wary, and frustrated with his defeat. Zuko constantly fails throughout the series. He is consistently defeated and outwitted. However, each of his failures just adds to his determination to succeed. and he goes to greater and greater lengths trying to capture the Avatar. Zuko has one of the most interesting story arcs of any of the characters in this show, or any character in a piece of media in general. He is deeply layered, and his character writing reflects the quality that this show has. Now, you might be wondering how this is different from my point about character progression. The difference is Zuko is the antagonist, not just one of the main characters. Well-written, layered antagonists are a rarity nowadays. In a time where the biggest franchises out there, such as Marvel and Star Wars, make sure to develop their villains as little as possible in order to keep them nice and disposable and dislikable, an enemy like Zuko is a breath of fresh air. The show spends almost as much time developing Zuko as it does developing our other main characters, and the fact that it does this goes beyond just character development. The show makes Zuko interesting, relatable, and even likable. I would venture to say that Zuko is probably one of the best antagonists anywhere in media. The second good point is the way bending as a mechanic is handled early on. Since the characters don't know the origin of bending, we don't get to either. However, the line from Iroh about breathing having a role in firebending makes it obvious that they put a lot of thought into how bending actually works. The next point was for Iroh. Iroh is the best. If you don't see it now, you will soon. Then there was a good point about the interconnectedness of the show. I already said pretty much everything I wanted to earlier, except to say that you'll see what I mean later once we cover more episodes. The sixth point, a positive one, was about how Avatar balances emotion and comedy. In many cases, a piece of media that tries to have both emotional moments and comedic moments will end up having one detract from the other. A good example is Thor Ragnarok. If you haven't seen it already, skip ahead to the timestamp on screen. There will be spoilers. I love the film, but it's hard to argue that the comedy doesn't take away from the emotion. Did you remember that Thor's friends all died, or that Valkyrie has a tragic past? Probably not. I didn't even notice that Thor's friends died the first time I saw it, though that could be because they're such forgettable characters. Ragnarok was a film full of death and destruction, but it sacrificed every emotional opportunity in order to be funny. Was it funny? Yeah, it was! It really was! The first time I saw it, I laughed for 5 minutes straight at the get help bit.
Get help! Please! My brother's dying! Get help! Help him!
And I was thoroughly entertained for the entire duration of the film. The thing is, though, that while Thor Ragnarok is funny, and very funny at that, that's about all it is. Avatar is different. In this episode alone, we get the messages that war forces children grow up faster, that people on opposite sides of a conflict often have much in common, and that sometimes to help the ones you love, you have to leave them for a while. We also get the idea of destiny, and that fear can be a good thing, demonstrated by Aang telling Katara to let go of fear, which causes them to set off a trap that leads Zuko to them. The first and third of these both connect to the theme of growing up, which is a major part of Avatar's narrative. There's probably more, but themes are subjective and difficult to quantify, so finding all the themes something has is impossible. Anyway, the fact that Avatar manages to be funny while also being meaningful should be applauded. The next point was also positive, and it was the fact that Avatar has amazing fight scenes. They have everything you could ask for from a fight scene. They have amazing choreography, the movement is well thought out, and the editing, even in an animated show, serves to emphasize the flow of a fight. They also have spectacle. Oh man, do they have spectacle. Bending has the potential to do a lot of cool stuff. Most importantly, though, every fight is about character. It's not just fun action sequences, we know exactly what the characters are fighting for. Every time two characters face off, our familiarity with their motivations makes it all the more impactful. In this episode, Sokka bravely fights to defend his village, Katara fights to protect her friends, and Aang fights to regain his freedom. Zuko, as the antagonist, is fighting to defeat Aang, so he can capture him and regain his honor. The way they fight is tied to this as well. Sokka charges, rather recklessly at Zuko, determined to defeat him no matter the personal risk. Katara, on the other hand, waits for the enemies to come to her, sticking to defense much more so than offense. Aang fights evasively, only attacking when absolutely necessary. This shows that he only wants to escape and not to hurt anyone if he doesn't have to. As for Zuko, he fights with the air of someone who knows what they're doing. It is clearly shown that he is the one with the most combat training, as we see Iroh teaching him formal drills, while Sokka, Aang, and Katara are clearly either entirely or almost entirely self-taught, given that none of them are shown to have a teacher. Given his knowledge of firebending, it is clear that Iroh is a skillful and experienced teacher, despite his harmless appearance and friendly demeanor. Iroh is not someone to be messed with, as we see when he looks angry at Zuko's demands, before deciding not to retaliate. In addition to this, when Zuko fights Aang, his soldiers stand to the side. Together, they could defeat him in seconds with little effort, but they merely ensure Aang doesn't try to escape. Now, from a tactical perspective, this doesn't make much sense, but from a character perspective, it makes perfect sense. Zuko doesn't just want to win, he wants to prove that he can, and that he doesn't need anyone else's help to do it. The lead-up to a fight scene often adds to this. For example, before Zuko and Sokka fight each other, we are shown both of them preparing for battle. They are both carefully preparing, demonstrating a respect for the ceremonial aspect of combat. Despite how different they are, the writers also want to show that they have a lot in common, and this is a much better way to go about it than having the villain go,
"We're not so different, you and I."
Yeah, we're not so different as you might think.
We're not so different after all.
We're not so different.
We are not so different.
Not so very different. Not so different.
Not so different.
Not so different.
We're not so different. Are we so different?
Not so very different.
yes, I'm looking at you, live-action Mulan.
Oh my God!
All this adds up to make every fight feel significant. We know exactly what the characters stand to lose if they are defeated. After Sokka lost, his village would have been at risk if not for Aang coming to help. If Katara had been defeated, she and her friends would have been at risk. Her future would have been at risk. Her chance to learn waterbending would have been at risk. If Aang failed to escape, he would have lost his freedom. Zuko did lose, and now his honor, his entire motivation, his chance to prove himself, is at risk once again. He had it secure, and Aang escaped, taking his honor with him. Even if the good gods always win in the end, the stakes are always clear and there's always some level of tension, and for this, Avatar should be commended. Far too many fight scenes nowadays fail to understand that fight scenes should be about character. It's not just about people hitting each other. If I wanted to see people hit each other, I would play Mortal Kombat. No, a fight scene is only really meaningful when you understand the motivations behind it. When it's a clash of personality and what people want, not just a clash of weapons and fists and punching. Even though most of the fight scenes do have flashy visuals, which makes sense given the nature of the show, they're more than that. They don't just look good, they are good, because they're primarily about character, not about visuals. The 8th point, negative once more, is about how Zuko managed to catch up with Aang and grab his glider. I already talked about this at length earlier, so there's not much more to say except to restate that it doesn't make much sense. The second to last point was about how these 2 episodes alone have character progression. I also discussed that in extreme detail earlier, so in order to avoid making this video unnecessarily longer, I'm not going to go over it again. Lastly, Avatar gets a point for its music and sound design.
Water. Earth. Fire. Air.
How did you do that? With the water? It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen.
It sets the tone perfectly, which is exactly what music should do. So how were these episodes overall? Well, of the 10 points I made, there were 8 positive and only 2 negative, so I'd say it was pretty good. I'm going to rank all the stuff I review with an open-ended scale by subtracting the negative points from the positive ones. In this case, that would give these episodes a score of 6. There's no maximum or minimum on this scale, which means that the scores only mean something relative to the scores of other things. Since this is the first thing I've reviewed, there's no other data to compare it to, so as I go through the other episodes of Avatar, we'll see how these first episodes measure up against later ones. This video took a really long time to make and a lot of effort, so if you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. I have a lot of love and appreciation for this show. To say I like this show, really like this show, or even love this show would be an understatement. I adore this show. With all this love for it, reviewing it all the way through is something I'm really looking forward to. Just reviewing this one episode, I realized how good the writing of the show really is. There's so much subtlety and meaning behind different things, and you can tell that the writers put a lot of effort in. Anyway, this has been The Cynical Enthusiast, currently feeling very enthusiastic. Until next time, friends.